Hey there. So I had a really interesting conversation last night with a couple of friends about the differences between 3 and 5. This is a misidentification that I think definitely happens frequently, but is one that I haven't thought about for some time. So it was kind of nice to have that memory jog and sort of that refreshed conversation come to surface again. So probably from a statistical standpoint, it's much more common for an Enneagram 3 to misidentify as an Enneagram 5 than it is in reverse, just because 5 is one of the 3 least common Enneagram types from like a statistical or like population standpoint. So mostly we're looking at 3 misidentifying as 5, but I'm sure there are some cases of 5s misidentifying as 3s as well. So of course, as always, starting with motivation and saying what are the main differences, and I think that is actually keys in this case specifically because 3s and 5s do share a lot of things in common. I think they both tend to think of themselves, or like to think of themselves as experts of a sort. They like to display their competence, but in different areas and for different reasons. So the things that motivate a 3 are very different than what motivates a 5, and then there are some differences that I've kind of so far been calling experiential differences between them that I think are some red flags as to the difference. But talking about motivation, and we've talked about this a little bit in a previous video, but 3 is motivated by that desire to win, to succeed, to achieve, but that, even behind that, is this sense of shame or worth tied to success or to winning or to being the best. And 3s tend to believe that if they don't win or succeed or are the best, then they won't be loved. So that is very much a heart issue, but I think for a lot of 3s, they may not realize they are heart types because 3s tend to sacrifice their heart's desire, as the text often says, in order to win or achieve, which is why we tend to see 3s wearing masks of all different sorts, or being the chameleon and blending in and saying, okay, you want me to do that, I'll do that and win. And if you want me to do this, I'll do that and win. And so they can, they're very adaptable people, which I think is actually one of their strengths on the high side, is that ability to go into a corporate situation or an athletic situation or a creative situation and really kind of do what they need to do and learn quickly and achieve. Now the downside to that and the shadow side of that is that in order to have that ability that they do, they have really shut down what their true essence is, like what their true self, their true identity is, in order to be all things to all people. So yeah, those are the motivations for 3, and why a 3 might be wanting to be seen as competent or as an expert. On the flip side, a 5 would want to be seen as competent or an expert because the motivation for 5 is, I guess we should start with the word avarice, which is another word for greed. But for 5s, that tends to be in relation to knowledge. So they tend to see the outside world as this place in which is dangerous to them unless they know all of the things. So when we think about the head types, 5, 6, and 7, we tend to think of 5 and 7 on either of the ends as either very comfortable in the head, like a 5, and very uncomfortable in the outer world, or very comfortable in the outer world like a 7, and uncomfortable inside with like darker things like a 7. So 5 is on that side of saying, okay, inside of my head is where my domain is, and as long as I know everything about blank, then everything's fine. So one of the main differences between these two motivations that we see, I think that is an experiential difference that came up in conversation last night with the friends that I was having this conversation with, is this difference in in regards to self-promotion, or what we might call bragging, in that a 3 is so much more self-promoting and self-praising, or as I've referred to before, calling that oral narcissism and needing to promote the self, than a 5 would be. Totally in the opposite way, a 5 would tend to sandbag themselves and hold back and actually not display their feathers to the extent that they have them. This comes from a place for 5 of being afraid of potentially not knowing everything. So by making a statement that they probably only like 90% know is true, they feel like that's this giant risk of potentially being wrong. So 5s actually in the opposite way tend to hold back and tend to hold the cards very close to the chest in that core sin of avarice, because they are so greedy with knowledge, and that it's like, that's something that I'm going to keep to myself. That's why with 5 too, we tend to see this quality of mystique, or of withdrawn sort of like that hidden nature of a 5, and that they don't always display all of their, and usually they don't. Even a 5 in my interview project, the photo one, I remember him talking about, he's a musician and he's played musical instruments all his life, and but from a young age of learning these instruments, he would only practice behind closed doors from his parents, and he would never play in front of his parents. And then he said that the first time his parents actually heard him play was when he was at, I think it was like late teens or very early 20s, when he was on a stage for something at his church, and that's the first time his parents had ever heard him play, even though they'd been putting him in music lessons his whole life, because he would not put it on display for that fear that 5s have of, okay, maybe I don't know everything. Do I know everything? I need to go over everything and make sure I know everything before I proceed. So that is the huge difference, I think, experientially between 3 and 5, is that 3s will tend to, with that tendency of deceit and self-deceit, 3s will exaggerate and tend to stretch the truth quite a bit, or say things that they can't back up in order to sound like they know what they're talking about. That's that, with that desire to win at all costs, or to be seen as the most successful, even if they necessarily aren't, because of that image focus that 3s have. 5s don't have that image focus. It's so much more about, and sometimes I would say 5s are even, they err on the opposite side, in that they shoot themselves in the foot a lot and don't actually, they don't exercise or use all of the capacity that they have, because they are fearful of coming out as not knowing everything that they actually do know. So you have that reserved or insecure manifestation on the 5 side of things, where they're holding themselves back, and then you have that you do see extroversion more on the 3 side and introversion much more on the 5 side, but so you have that more extroverted kind of false confidence piece of the 3 as well on that side, so you have pretty much opposites there. I do want to note that in integration you see change there. So if you are a 3 or a 5 and you're watching this and you're very offended because I just talked basically about the largest faults of 3 and 5, fear not. I do know and totally acknowledge that when integration happens, there is this massive change of those traits. I mean, that's one of the coolest things to see in a 5 is when 5 integrates to 8 and they step out in that authority of, hey, I do know what I'm talking about, and I have researched this over and over and over, and I don't need to check it 700 more times before I say, I think I know what I'm saying. And 3 on the other side of realizing, you know what, I don't need to have everyone approve of me. I don't need to have that status of winner or that label of most successful if I know that I'm succeeding in not just succeeding for myself, but succeeding for the team and those around me. And there's that loyalty aspect when 3 goes to 6. So for sure, these types have awesome growth potential, but those differences are kind of the average health red flags, I would say, if you're trying to decide between 3 and 5. I think that that's pretty much it when it comes to overt differences. Of course, there's a lot of nuanced meat underneath. So if you want to read more on the blog, I have some resource suggestions, and of course there are those core type infographics. And if you haven't looked at instincts yet, I feel like that's a really great place to look at too, when you look at the instinctual differences between 3 and 5, which of course I'll have to make a separate video on eventually. Thanks so much for checking it out, and I hope you will check out the other videos and the infographics at the Enneagram Girl WordPress blog. Thanks so much.